Nomonhan Incident. The battles of Kokon-Gol in 1939 were key conflicts in the undeclared Soviet-Japanese border disputes involving the Soviet Union, Mongolia, Japan, and Manchukuo. They were fought near the Kokon-Gol River, hence the name. In Japan, it's known as the Nomonhan Incident, and it ended with the defeat of the Japanese Sixth Army. In the late 1930s, Japan shifted its military focus towards Soviet territories bordering areas they had occupied, leading to conflicts along the Soviet-Japanese border. The Battle of Lake Khasan in 1938 marked a significant clash. In 1939, Manchukuo was a Japanese puppet state, while Mongolia was a Soviet-aligned communist state. The border dispute centered on the Kokon-Gol River, with Japan claiming it as the border while Mongolia and the Soviets insisted it was further east, near Nomonhan village. The Japanese Guandong Army in Manchukuo and the 23rd Infantry Division in the western region were responsible for defending the area. The 23rd Division was relatively inexperienced and ill-equipped. Soviet forces included the 57th Special Corps, and Mongolian troops mainly consisted of cavalry and light artillery units. Georgy Zhukov was sent to take command of the 57th Special Corps and counter Japanese provocations. In 1939, the Japanese cabinet instructed the Guandong Army to fortify Manchukuo's borders with Mongolia and the Soviet Union. The Guandong Army, stationed far from Japan's home islands, had become largely autonomous and sometimes acted independently of the Japanese government's direction. The incident began in May 1939 when a Mongolian cavalry unit entered a disputed area to find grazing for their horses. Manchu cavalry attacked them, but the Mongolians returned in greater numbers, and the Manchukuoans couldn't remove them. Lieutenant Colonel Yaozo Azuma led Japanese forces into the territory on May 14, and the Mongolians withdrew. However, Soviet-Mongolian forces later surrounded Azuma's force and destroyed it on May 28, resulting in significant casualties. Grigory Stern was the commander of the Soviet forces in the Far East Front from May 1938. Both Japan and the Soviet Union increased their forces in the area, with Japan amassing around 30,000 troops. The Soviets sent Conqueror Georgy Zhukov, along with more motorized and armored forces, to the combat zone, bolstering their presence. Conqueror Yakov Smushkevich and J. Kagvazirin also played key roles. On June 27, the Japanese Army Air Force's 2nd Air Brigade attacked a Soviet airbase in Mongolia, winning the engagement. However, this strike was unauthorized by Imperial Japanese Army headquarters in Tokyo, and Tokyo promptly ordered no more airstrikes against Soviet airbases to prevent escalation. In June, there were reports of Soviet and Mongolian activity on both sides of the river near Nomonhan, including small-scale attacks on isolated Manchukuoan units. At the end of the month, Lieutenant General Michitaro Komatsubara, commander of the 23rd Japanese Infantry Division, received permission to expel the invaders. The Japanese planned a two-pronged assault in the Kokon-Gol conflict. The first attack involved several regiments advancing across the Kokengol River, aiming to destroy Soviet forces on Bainsagan Hill on the west bank and then move south to the Kawatama Bridge. The second prong was the responsibility of the IJA 1st Tank Corps, attacking Soviet troops on the east bank of the Kokengol and north of the Holson River. The two prongs were meant to join forces. The Northern Task Force successfully crossed the river, but the Soviets launched a counterattack with tanks and armored cars, nearly encircling the Japanese. Hindered by limited supplies and a single pontoon bridge, the Japanese were forced to withdraw. Meanwhile, the Southern Task Force, the 1st Tank Corps, engaged in a pitched battle but couldn't break through the Soviet defenses on the east bank and reach the Kawatama Bridge. The Soviet counterattack on July 9 further pushed the Japanese back, leading to the dissolution of the Isuoka detachment. Over the following weeks, both sides clashed along a 4-kilometer front along the east bank of the Kokengol. The Japanese faced supply issues due to a lack of motor transport, while the Soviets managed to supply their troops effectively with a fleet of 2,600 trucks. Despite a massive Japanese assault on July 23, including heavy artillery support, they couldn't break through Soviet lines and reach the bridge. The battle eventually reached a stalemate, with both sides suffering casualties, but the Japanese's losses were particularly high. With the threat of war in Europe looming and to avoid fighting on two fronts, Zhukov planned a major offensive on August 20, 1939, to drive the Japanese out of the Kokengol region and end the conflict. He assembled a formidable armored force, including tank brigades and mechanized brigades, supported by infantry divisions and a significant air presence. In contrast, the Japanese Guandong Army had only the 23rd Infantry Division and various attached forces in the area, equivalent to 2 light infantry divisions. Japanese intelligence had failed to anticipate the scale of the Soviet offensive, and they were caught off guard. The Soviets had previously launched probing assaults that were repelled by the Japanese, but these skirmishes did not lead to major battles. On August 20, the Soviets launched a massive attack with artillery and aircraft, followed by ground forces, achieving a double envelopment of the Japanese. The Soviet wings linked up on August 25, trapping the Japanese 23rd Infantry Division. Despite Japanese attempts to break the encirclement, they were unsuccessful. By August 31, Japanese forces on the Mongolian side of the border were destroyed, and the Soviets had achieved their objective. A ceasefire agreement was reached on September 15, taking effect on September 16, 1939, ending the conflict. During the battles of Kokengol, Japanese records reported approximately 8,440 killed, 8,766 wounded, 162 aircraft lost in combat, and 42 tanks lost, with 29 repaired and redeployed. Around 500 to 600 Japanese and Manchurian soldiers were taken prisoner, although most were listed as killed in action due to a no-surrender policy. Some sources suggested much higher Japanese casualties, up to 45,000 or more killed, with Soviet casualties of at least 17,000. However, these estimates were considered inaccurate as they exceeded the total strength of the Japanese forces involved. Recent assessments, based on Soviet archives, put Soviet casualties at 7,974 killed and 15,251 wounded. In a newer edition, Soviet losses were given as 9,703 killed or missing, 15,251 wounded, and 701 to 2,225 sick, totaling between 25,655 and 27,179 casualties. Additionally, the Soviets lost a significant amount of equipment, including 253 tanks, 250 aircraft, 96 artillery pieces, and 133 armored cars. Mongolian casualties were estimated at 556 to 990, with the loss of at least 11 armored cars and 1,921 horses and camels. Nomonhan marked the first large-scale use of airpower in a high-intensity battle for a specific military objective. The conflict ended with a ceasefire on September 16, 1939, but the two sides remained at peace until August 1945 when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchukuo and other territories after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. The battles of Kokengol, although not well known in the West, had significant implications for Japan's conduct in World War II. It led to disapproval from Tokyo officials, not just because of the defeat but because it had been initiated and escalated without direct authorization from the Japanese government. This defeat, coupled with Chinese resistance in the Second Sino-Japanese War and the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, shifted the Japanese Imperial General Staff's focus away from a North Strike Group policy which aimed to seize Siberia for its resources favored by the army. Instead, support grew for the South Strike Group, favored by the Navy, which aimed to seize the resources of Southeast Asia, particularly the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Masanobu Tsuji, a Japanese colonel involved in the Nomonhan Incident, strongly advocated for the attack on Pearl Harbor. General Ryukichi Tanaka, a high-ranking army official in 1941, testified that Tsuji was the most determined proponent of war with the United States. However, Tsuji's experience at Nomonhan, facing Soviet firepower, convinced him not to advocate for an attack on the Soviet Union in 1941. In 1941, as the war on the Eastern Front broke out between Germany and the Soviet Union, Japan and the Soviet Union reaffirmed their neutrality pact. Japan's focus shifted southward due to the oil embargo imposed by the United States and Britain, and the Pacific Fleet was the only obstacle to seizing the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. This ultimately led to the decision to attack Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Although there were plans for a potential war against the USSR, especially contingent on German advances towards Moscow, Japan never launched an offensive against the Soviet Union. In 1941, both countries signed agreements respecting the borders of Mongolia and Manchukuo and pledged neutrality towards each other. In the final months of World War II, the Soviet Union annulled the Neutrality Pact and invaded Japanese territories in Manchuria, northern Korea, and the southern part of Sakhalin Island. The Battle of Kokengol marked the first major victory for the Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, who would go on to receive 4 Hero of the Soviet Union awards in his illustrious career. Two other generals, Grigory Stern and Yakov Smushkevich, also played significant roles and were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union. However, both Stern and Smushkevich would later be executed in the 1941 purges. Zhukov's experience gained from the battle proved valuable in the Battle of Moscow in December 1941, where he successfully led the first Soviet counteroffensive against the German invasion. The movement of Siberian and other Transural armies to Moscow, a crucial decision, was aided by Soviet spy Richard Sorge in Tokyo, who informed the Soviet government that the Japanese were more likely to focus on the south and not launch another attack against Siberia in the near future. A year after defending Moscow, Zhukov orchestrated the Red Army's successful offensive at the Battle of Stalingrad, employing a similar strategy to Kokhin-Gol, where the Soviets held the enemy in the center and launched a pincer attack on the flanks. Despite their victory at Kokhin-Gol and the subsequent Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, the Soviets were dissatisfied with the overall performance of their army. The Red Army had a technological and numerical advantage but suffered significant losses, which were attributed to poor leadership. The Red Army remained cautious about the possibility of another Japanese incursion even into early 1944, and maintained a substantial force in the Far East during the European War. General A. K. Kazakovtsev, the Soviet operations chief of the Far Eastern Front, expressed doubts about their ability to repel a Japanese invasion if it occurred, particularly in 1941 to 1942. Both the Soviets and the Japanese viewed the outcome of the Battle of Kokhin-Gol as highlighting the need to address material disparities rather than tactical failures. The Japanese implemented several reforms in response to the battle, including increasing tank production, establishing a mechanized headquarters, and introducing the Type 147mm anti-tank gun to counter the Soviet 45mm gun. They also sent General Tomoyuki Yamashita to Germany to learn about tank tactics, leading to plans for the formation of 10 new armored divisions. However, Japanese industry struggled to match the production capabilities of the United States and the Soviet Union, and Yamashita warned against going to war with them for this reason. Despite improvements and experience gained at Kokhin-Gol, the Japanese continued to underestimate their adversaries. They emphasized the individual courage and determination of their soldiers to compensate for their numerical and industrial disadvantages. The battle also revealed shortcomings in Japanese medical procedures, with a lack of first aid training and a doctrine that forbade first aid without prior orders from an officer. This contributed to a significant number of Japanese casualties due to untreated wounds. Additionally, a substantial portion of casualties were attributed to dysentery, which the Japanese believed was caused by Soviet biological warfare aerial bombs. To address these issues, future Japanese divisions included specialized epidemic prevention and water purification departments. Finally, Japanese food rations were found to be inadequate in packing and nutritional value. Thank you for watching.